Hello and welcome to another modelling video. This is Alan from the MoConoman at YouTube with another model video. Building the Airfix HO 00 scale, 1/87th scale, Leopard 1 tank. Originally released in 1970, this boxing in 1982, up to the 90s, no variations of this model has been released since ceasing production in France. This is a very rare and sought after kit for collectors. I'll be working on this project away from home with a small selection of tools from a toolbox and a wireless APR 150 battery operated airbrush. The box contains 4 injection moulded dark green runners. It seems the mould is starting to fail a bit as quite a bit of flash is evident, though no further imperfections. 1 set of rubber vinyl tracks, small sheet of water slide decals, some paperwork for part ordering and a club, and a booklet of instructions with drafted guide on assembly and quite a bit of text on the history and hobby tips. The instructions are clear, well laid out, and very easy to understand. The detail is a mixture of raised and sunken panels. Does seem pretty fun to paint. Most likely due to age or poor storage, the tracks seem to have melted into the plastic and left an indent in the runner. However, no damage to any of the parts. Assembly should not be too difficult as there's appropriate joints and connectors. Immediately I've started double cutting the gates to remove the parts, trimming down the nub and sanding them flat. As this is pretty shiny, I'll be lightly sanding the whole piece down for better paint adhesion. Working on some tiny kits recently, I really appreciate large numbers imprinted in the runners as well as the instructions. My choice of cement for this project is plain Tamiya white, as there may be some gaps and heavy welding is required. It was liberally applied to the edge and squished into place, allowing a few hours to dry after being sandwiched. This made for a very strong bond and very little used for seam line filling. For the year produced, Airfix was known of being a high quality product at the time, and the box assembly of the hull was no exception. It clicked together very well and held its shape while drying. The next step is not particularly a favourite of mine, doing the suspension and wheel work. Each of the sprockets are glued into place. A lot of tedious work of cutting out each wheel and sanding them in together. Then they were easily glued into place, allowed a day to dry, then the wheels the next day. This also allowed another day to dry to glue on their tracks. I may have confused the order of the wheels as they are slightly crooked and not well set. While waiting during this multi-day process, I jumped ahead in the instructions and glued the turret into place to deal with the seam line, applying automotive filler primer mixed with bicarb baking soda with a fine toothpick applicator. This was allowed the same 2-day period to dry before sanding and finishing. Once the wheels are fully dried and chemically hardened and set, we're able to deal with the rubber tracks. Any flash was trimmed off with a knife and slid at the top with a bit of super glue to hold it in place. I tried to make it sag a bit, but it didn't work out. After a few hours, a bit was flipped over and glued into place, and the final bridge was glued at a later date and sat upright to allow to dry all connected. Being stored for 2 decades, it was easy enough to work with, and the last few bits of detail were glued to the hull. Moving to the next step, we finished off the hull by cutting out all the hatches and additional pieces and glued in. This model works by having the hatches in the open or closed position. The gun barrel was a bit basic and needed to be drilled out for an ordnance hole, and the seam line sanded down gently not to flatten. It was cemented into place, not allowing much articulation as it didn't click in solidly, and all the finer details including sensors and the machine guns glued into place, leaving us with a fully assembled model. With HO scale kits, I have a difficult sense of scaling if it's historically believable or not, though the proportions look pretty good compared to the references I had a look for the Leopard 1 tank, which I don't believe was used too widely. Mostly Leopard 2 is the popular modelling subject. The detail is believable and it looks pretty good. I would recommend this build. Pulling out the battery operated airbrush and thinning down the automotive filler primer with lacquer thinner, we've given it a liberal coating of primer to look for any imperfections, gaps or seams, and it seems to have popped out really well on the first go. Utilising some very old Guns and Tamiya acrylics sitting around for a decade and a half, we've airbrushed the hull and turret in 3 to 4 tones of military green, starting with a very dark colour under the wheels, underneath and around the base of the turret, and building up in a light gradient sense of coating the rest of the tank and highlighting the very top. Once dried, we've painted the tank tracks with burnt iron and touched up all the details such as the machine guns, smoke launchers and all the stowage on the side of the hull. The stowage is very thick in detail popping out of the side and was easy enough to pick out with a paintbrush, though the chunky detail is probably in reference to most hobbyists hand painting the whole project from the period. Once finished, I've top coated everything with a smooth lacquer Mr. Hobby clear flat. After that dried, everything was touched with a pin wash of Tamiya accent colour cut with more enamel thinner for easier flow. And water slide decals, the original ones, were chopped up and soaked in water for about 2 minutes. They seem to be in good enough condition and separated and applied easier enough. Unfortunately, with the lacquer paint sealing it on top, it's reacted badly and 2 of the decals did curl up. There was not much I can do about that. Playing around with a new product, Mr. Hobby Flat Base Rough, cutting it with a clear matte, was applied. This made it a lot easier to use weathering pencils and pigments for a bit of a light wear look. Top coated that finally and we were finished with a model. I did add an additional UN decal that came with a West German decal set I've had sticking around. It's not exactly accurate, but it's interesting enough for the toy-like nature of an older model. It was just fun, and this finished very well. Besides the right side decal being damaged, I can't really complain about the overall finish. I most likely should have invested in a new set of decals or used the slightly larger one I had on hand. And realistically, at a much later date, there's nothing stopping me from stripping the decals or the paint and going over it a second time. I'm personally very happy with my efforts. I highly recommend the build if you can get the Airfix boxing of it. It is quite rare and hard to get, though. There are other Panther 1 offerings out on the market, most likely at a suitable 70-second scale, as again this is probably the biggest turn off and a bit weird unless you do wish to utilize it in a model railway layout. This particular box was encountered in a country estate and passed on to me as a second-hand item to be traded in the salt mine hobby shop. This concludes my build on the Airfix HO scale Leopard 1. I'm really glad to get this historically difficult piece to acquire in my collection, and more so happy that I was able to document it in video form to show each of the steps and the experience in building it as a child would have done it in the 70s to 80s. Thank you very much for watching, and until next time, stay tuned for further content. Please check out my playlist on small scale armor for more vintage and modern builds. Down below in the description section is the links to all the social media accounts for up-to-date builds and activities on the channel, and we'll catch you guys next time. Thank you very much for watching, and stay tuned for more.